Hello, and welcome to my presentation for Ishtarfest. My name is Steff V Scott, and I'm the presiding officer of the Scottish Pagan Federation. I am a prominent pagan rights activist in my home country, and for my faith, I am a Sumerian Reconstructionist pagan. I sit on the board of the Pagan Heathen Symposium representing Sumerian paganism, and I am the founder of the Temple of Inanna organisation, and the founder of the Council of Near Eastern Pagan Religions, and I am the director of Inanna Press. Now, my academic background is in archaeology. I study archaeology between the University of Edinburgh and the University of Glasgow, with the focus on the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia, although I also study ritual practices and magic. I study the literature of the ancient Near East, art of the ancient Near East, as well as aspects of Near Eastern demonology and some of the cults of Near Eastern deities such as Anat and Mithras. I also study magic in ancient Greece and Rome and the origin of the Mediterranean civilizations. Now today's talk is called Understanding Inanna, and it's pretty much an introduction to the goddess. The goddess who endured. Inanna stands at the dawn of history, a wild woman, beautiful, passionate, ferocious and untamable, a union of opposites, mother of love, lust, passion and warfare. She sits astride a mighty lion, teeth bared, her roar resounding down throughout the ages, a stark reminder of her immense power and of her influence. She is a goddess of kingship and dominion, of love and passionate embraces, of ambition and the attainment of great victories, both in warfare and in personal conflicts. She is a goddess with the power to raise the dead and bring the sick, weak and weary back to health, wealth and well-being. She is a goddess of women and children, and of great armies and of mighty kingdoms, and of the lost and those who wish to be found. She is a goddess of mothers and sons, of kings and queens, of high priestesses, and of tavern keepers and prostitutes. She is a goddess for all of the people, no matter their position or place in society, nor sexuality, for all were welcome in her temple cult, and the people revered her for it. She is a goddess of many aspects, perhaps more so than any other deity, and this is something that has always left academics perplexed. How can a goddess be so much and to so many? How can one goddess be associated with agriculture and fertility and healing and the hunt and battle and be a storm goddess and a war goddess and a goddess of love and a goddess of death and a goddess of burial practices? These questions have modern academics torn. Some academics have even suggested whether there were not a great number of different Inannas, where one was associated with the fields, while another was associated with war, while another, entirely separate goddess, was associated with love. However, these aspects make perfect sense when you read and understand her full mythology, and you see her story unfold. Yes, Inanna is a goddess of agriculture. You see her early on in her mythology as still a young girl, where she brings the date palm back to the city of Uruk and becomes a goddess of the storehouse. At this point of her mythology, she is a fertility goddess. A little later in her mythology, we see her being courted by two men who are trying to win her heart and win her hand in marriage, and there is an epic love triangle going on. At this point in her mythology, she is a goddess of love and of passion. Then, later in her mythology, she is abandoned and abused and then raped. And we see her emerge at this point of her mythology as a goddess wronged, demanding vengeance and divine retribution. At this stage of her mythology, she becomes both a war goddess and a goddess of the storm. Then later in her mythology, we see her journey to the netherworld and die there, only to be resurrected. At this stage of her mythology, she becomes a goddess associated with death and funerary practices. Yes, one goddess can be all of those things and more. You just need to understand her story and the various stages she goes through on that journey. Her story also works on various levels, for interwoven through their narrative is the rise and fall of kings and kingdoms, of emperors and empires, and of high priestesses and dynasties. Her mythology captures the history of Mesopotamia as told over millennia through the eyes of the goddess. And while all of those empires rose and fell, still Inanna's worship continued unabated. Inanna's worship dates back long before recorded history. It dates back to a time even before the Sumerian era. It dates to a time when her patron city of Uruk was still a small settlement called the Kulaba. This settlement first emerged during the early Ubaidian period around 5300 BC. According to the archaeology of the region, this settlement merged with a neighbouring settlement known as the Inanna. These two distinct regions, the Kulab and the Inanna, would go on to become two major districts of the city of Uruk. We find this development captured in the literature from the earliest myths of Sumer, and they come from Uruk itself. We have this preserved in the myth Lugalbanda and the Anzu bird. This myth details Inanna's place in the earliest history of the city. This myth itself details how Inanna once was worshipped in the mountains, but she moved to the brick-built Kulaba in the earliest history of the city. This may have been a time before both settlements were merged. This myth tells us that these settlements began as marshes, full of water and reed thickets. In time, the reeds were cut down, canals were dug, groundwater drained, and the settlements merged, and over time they grew into a city. At this time period, the goddess would have been venerated as a patron goddess of the storehouse, and as a guardian goddess of dates, wool, meat, and grain, and all the foods that were stored there to prevent them from perishing. Inanna's earliest role was as guardian of the harvest, and this was an incredibly important role when civilization first began, as she ensured the protection of the food that would be later redistributed by the temple to feed the city. We also see this role represented in the earliest written form of Inanna's name, where she was first represented as a pictograph of the gateposts of the reed-built storehouse. At this point she is referred to as the Lady of the Day Clusters from the earliest time period and the earliest written word. Reed-built storehouses still exist to this day among the Madan people, the marsh Arabs of southern Mesopotamia. These structures are called motifs and have existed in one form or another in this region for over 5 millennia. They maintain an unbroken cultural tradition that stretches back far into the Ubaidian period in Near Eastern history. By the late 12th century, there were still over 500,000 Arabs maintaining this unbroken way of life. This changed in the early 1990s when Saddam Hussein attempted to destroy the culture of the Madan people by draining and damming up the marshes. At this time, this move was condemned across the Western world as an act of genocide and of ethnic cleansing. The United Nations described this as a tragic human environmental catastrophe on par with the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest, while others described it as one of the worst environmental disasters of the 20th century. However, a decade later, and following Hussein's defeat, the communities returned to the marshes. They re-flooded the marshlands, dug up the dikes, and resumed their traditional way of life. New reed-built motifs arose again in this region, and though the people did not acknowledge their significance, the symbol of Inanna rose once again. The rise of Inanna. Inanna rose in prominence during the Ubaidian period as the patron goddess of Uruk, and as her settlement grew in terms of size and stature, rising in prominence into a major city, so too did the status and stature of Inanna as the city's guardian spirit. Her earliest temple in Uruk dates to around 4200 BCE. It was built over 1600 years before the first pyramid of Egypt. During this time period, Inanna's nature and deeper mythology would have been that of agrarian in nature. By the Uruk expansion period, when the city became the largest and most prominent metropolis in the world at the time, Inanna's position continued to rise, not just in Uruk, but all across the rest of Mesopotamia and beyond. By the time we reach the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia, we find Inanna, due to the status of Uruk, had risen to the head of the pantheon of the old Sumerian god lists. These are the earliest records of how the pantheons of Sumer were first arranged. In the Pharaoh god list, SF1, Inanna is listed as the third major deity in the pantheon, behind only An, the father of the gods, and Enlil, the head of the pantheon. Ahead of prominent gods such as Enki and the moon god Nana and the god of the sun Utu. In the Pharaoh god list, SF7, she is listed as second in the pantheon, behind only the god Enlil. In the Zami hymns from the same time period, Inanna is listed as the third major deity in the pantheon, behind only Enlil and the goddess Ninbonog. In the very earliest royal inscriptions of Eannatum, Sumerian king who established one of the world's first empires, Inanna is listed as third in the pantheon, behind Enlil, the mother goddess Ninhursag, and still ahead of the god Enki. There is no disputing that even during the earliest Sumerian times, she was already a formidable goddess. At this time period, another development was taking place in Sumer, and one that first took place in Uruk. That concept was the rise and development of the concept of kingship. During the 4th millennium BC, the temple was the head and the centre of early cities. It acted not only as the cultic and ritual centre of the city, but the administrative centre of all life there. It was at the front and centre of the management of redistribution of food, as well as management of labour that was involved in shaping the city, of digging irrigation canals to drain the water from the site, of building and construction projects, and of overseeing all aspects of life within both the city and its environs. This shift took place towards palace over temple during the early dynastic period, round about 2900 to 2350 BC. The earliest kings of this period of Uruk were Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and Dumuzi, and the historic king Gilgamesh, taking over the reins of rulership from the temple. These four historic kings all hail from the time period when the shift in social structure took place, and all four of them were interwoven into the mythology as a way to establish the role of kingship over priesthood, as well as explaining the transfer of power from the temple to the palace. The kings in this period were mythologized, not just as great rulers, but in many ways deified. They took on divine attributes in their mythologies. Given it was also the city of Uruk that developed the first writing systems in history, and therefore wrote the first epic tales, it is perhaps reflective of these mythologies that the four earliest kings were remembered long after those kingdoms had risen and fell. This change in social structure also established a direct link from the gods to the king as the divine appointed ruler on earth. Given Inanna's position in the city of Uruk as its patron goddess, it is hardly surprising that she would end up featuring prominently in that literature. Two of the rulers from this time period, the historic king Dumuzi and his successor Gilgamesh, were said to have ruled somewhere between 2900 to 2700 BCE. These datings are important, given that both kings would become intimately intertwined with Inanna's wider literature, with both taking on divine status. Gilgamesh himself becoming two-thirds of a god, with Dumuzi rising even further to become a complete deity, being merged and syncretized with a much earlier shepherding god to become the consort of Inanna, with Inanna's sacred marriage to the king giving him divine status, and ceding the power from the palace to the temple, with the king becoming the conduit to the divine realm. The concept of divine kingship is often a subject we attribute to Egypt, with their concept of deified god-kings. However, the earliest kings of Mesopotamia are also tied to the role of deified god-kings, reminiscent of the cults of the ancestors that came before it. As the mythology of deified kingship developed, alongside the role of Inanna in both relationship to kingship and marriage to the king, we see Inanna emerge at the end of this time period as a goddess intimately tied with the act of legitimizing kingship, and transferring the power of legitimate rule from one city to another. Taking on this role and function, we see the goddess rise in rank and prominence during later periods. By the Akkadian period, 2334 BC to 2154 BC, under the rise of one of the world's first major empires, we see another development taking place. This development would cede Inanna's position for millennia to come. Under Sargon of Akkad, the goddess Inanna was merged and syncretized with another major goddess, Ishtar. Sargon himself is widely recognized as one of the world's first emperors. He succeeded in conquering not just Sumer, but Upper Mesopotamia, as well as Elam and Marhashi, where he is said to have conquered 34 cities in total. Sargon unified both northern and southern Mesopotamia under one great empire. Part of his success in subduing Sumer was the installation of his daughter Enheduanna as the high priestess of the Sumerian city of Ur. Sargon's primary deity during this period was the Semitic goddess Ishtar. It was under the theology of his daughter Enheduanna, the high priestess of Ur, which undersaw the merging of both Inanna and Ishtar into one major political powerhouse of a goddess not just associated with date palms in the storehouse, or kingship and the legitimization of rulership. During this process, Inanna took on many of the goddess Ishtar's attributes as a goddess of both warfare and conflict, and also the living embodiment of the planet Venus. Though it is worth pointing out that Inanna also had Venusian aspects, so this may have been why both deities were merged. The goddess of the stars. The Semitic goddess Ishtar was first attested to the 3rd millennium BC in the ancient Near East, with her earliest written records appearing in the Pharaoh god lists found in the ancient Sumerian city of Shirapak, which date to around 2600 BC. Alongside this mention, her name was also recorded as several personal epithets or titles. These include Ishtar is my mother, he of Ishtar, the fruit of Ishtar, and Ishtar is my man. These date to around the same time period. All these early attestations date to the pre-Sargonic time period and form part of the early Semitic pantheon. It was during this time period that Akkadian names were first attested in Sumerian cuneiform texts, with full Akkadian texts first appearing a little time later. All of these earliest attestations date to the pre-Sargonic period and form part of the early Semitic pantheon. It was during this time period that Akkadian names were first attested in Sumerian cuneiform texts, with full Akkadian texts first appearing a little later, from between the 25th to the 24th century BC, just before the Sargonic period began. As we date the Sargonic period from 2334 to 2284 BC, we find the Semitic goddess Ishtar first written as Ishtar, and first appearing in Sumerian texts roughly 300 years before the Sumerian goddess was merged with the Semitic goddess Ishtar. As for Ishtar's origins, nothing appears in the written record before this time period, given the written word first began in Sumer. Academics surmise we can trace her origins back to the Anatolian region, which is the area the Akkadians first emerged. This ties with the goddess with the power over beasts, who was found to be venerated in Catalhuyuk. The etymology of the earliest origins of the name we find also tied to the early Indo-European Hastur, meaning star, where she was believed to have been venerated in Anatolia as the planet Venus. This would have been long before the early Ubaidian period, where the celestial spheres were first assigned human form, and long before the anthropomorphization of the natural world. From the Indo-European Hastur, it is believed she developed into the Proto-Semitic Atar, meaning star or Venus, to then the Proto-Semitic Atar, meaning star or Venus, and from there she branched off into the Western Semitic Atar, still meaning Venus or star, to the Eastern Semitic Atar, from where she became first attested as a goddess in the early Akkadian Ishtar or Ishtar, and Elabite Ishtar or Ashtar. The elevation of Inanna. After Inanna was merged and syncretized with Ishtar, we can see her continue to rise higher and higher in the pantheon into the Akkadian period as her strength and influence grew in scope and size. By the Babylonian period, 1894 BC to 1595 BC, we see her elevated even further to position of national goddess of all of Mesopotamia. There she stayed for the rest of the empire's history. This is reflected in the spread and influence of her worship. While the Sumerian mother goddess Ninhursag had 21 temples by this time period, Inanna had over 190 temples throughout the whole of Mesopotamia alone. The closest god to Inanna was Enlil, with 79 temples, closely followed with Bau, with 64 temples across all of Mesopotamia. Then the primary god of magic Enki, who had 54 temples, while the moon god Nana had 51 temples. When we look at a goddess like Ereshkigal, who is often compared as a sister of Inanna in texts, even though the goddesses bore no relation whatsoever, it is worth pointing out that the goddess Ereshkigal only had one temple in Mesopotamia for most of its history, gaining another two temples only late into the Assyrian period. After this period, even with the fall of the Assyrian Empire in 600 BC, still Inanna Ishtar's worship continued unabated. It continued on into modern times, despite the rise of Christendom and the spread of Islam. Despite these new religious movements, Inanna was still worshipped, even late into the 10th century in the Common Era. by the Sabaeans, who sang laments to Ishtar and Tammuz. We also have attestations of the cult of Ishtar still being in existence in Mardin, southern Turkey, as late as the 18th century, which is only a few hundred years ago. Her worship finally died out, only with the Syrian massacres and genocides carried out by the Ottoman state, which took place from 1895 to 1896, and then from 1909, and then later between 1914 and 1924. Out of 1 million Assyrians worldwide, this left 850,000 dead and 250,000 displaced. No records of her cult are attested after this time period, though her name did live on even after this period, as she was still attested in the Bible. There have been many prominent goddesses who came after, but surpassing them all stood Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth. We are not saying here that other goddesses were not important in their own right. We are saying that in recorded history of the world, no other goddess has influenced so many and for so long. It should not be taken lightly that her worship spanned over a time period of over 6,000 years of continuous worship. I can think of no other deity who can claim such longevity and endurance. Understanding Inanna. Inanna's descent into the netherworld is perhaps one of the widely known myths from ancient Mesopotamia, second only to the Epic of Gilgamesh in terms of readership and popularity. It is required reading in most universities while studying the ancient Near East, although it is perhaps the most misunderstood myth. In the myth, we see Inanna getting ready to travel to the Great Below to visit her sister Ereshkigal. She first instructs her faithful minister Ninshibur on what she should do should she not return, and then she sets off on her journey. During this journey she passes through a series of 7 gates. At each gate she has an item of clothing stripped from her, until, at the final gate, she is naked and unarmed. When she finally enters the palace of the Netherworld, she is struck down dead and hung on a meat hook. Of course, there is much more to the myth than that. First, we must look at the history of the myth in terms of its audience and reception, especially in regard to pagandom. The myth was first rediscovered in excavations in the Sumerian city of Nippur around 1889 to 1900, though it would take another 50 years before the cuneiform texts were cleaned, restored, documented, compiled, translated, and finally published. Much had happened in that time period. The first few fragments of myth were first published by Stephen Langdon in 1914. Langdon went on to publish the first rendition of the myth in 1916, though at that point the meaning of the text was obscure, given that only 30 lines of the 412 we have today were actually translated. The breakthrough in understanding the text came from Edward Shearer, though he sadly passed away before he could publish his findings. His findings were published posthumously in 1934 by Samuel Noah Kramer, who we have to thank for his 1954 version of the text, which expanded greatly on Shearer's work. Kramer went on to refine his version over the next 20 years, taking the line count of the myth from 250 to 360 lines in his 1972 authorised version. In doing so, he made the myth much more widely known and understood. Over the next decade, Kramer published more and more translations before his passing, the most notable of which was the book Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, Her Stories and Hymns from Sumer. This was co-authored by cultural folklorist Diana Wilkstein. Over this 10-year period, the myth, through Kramer's dedication and hard work, became much more widely known and much more widely accessible to the outside world. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, the myth, The Descent of Inanna, captured the hearts, minds and imaginations of a series of growing cultural and socio-political movements, which included second-wave feminism, neo-paganism and the goddess spirituality movement. At this point, the descent myth was reappropriated and repackaged using Jungian psychology and a series of path workings as a way to empower women. In this process, the goddesses in the texts were reduced to archetypes, by which women undergoing this process went through what could be described as a rite of passage to reconnect with their feminine principle. From this point on, feminist pagan authors and theologians would try to reimagine the goddess Inanna, using gender reappropriation to repackage her into a mother goddess archetype. This led to many proponents of this movement rejecting the warlike aspects of the goddess Inanna, as they believed these traits were the result of the patriarchy. They argued that war was typical of androcratic or male-dominated societies that were not typical of gynocentric or mother-woman-centered cultures. As a result of this, the goddess was reimagined as a loving, protective, nurturing, fertile Inanna, one who embodies fertility, the wheel of birth, growth, death, and regeneration, which they believed was much more genuine in the understanding of the goddess. Goddess worshippers were encouraged to downplay and ignore several aspects of the goddess's sphere of influence, with a focus on selective reading of her mythology, in line with modern gendered interests, on what they deemed to be preconceived notions of what it is to be a properly feminine mother goddess. Inanna was not the only deity to suffer at the hands of the feminist goddess movement and feminist goddess theologians, as there was also a complete rejection of the goddess Athene by this movement because of her associations with war. Their arguments were, well, war is characteristic of the masculine, while peace and harmony are viewed as characteristics of the feminine. These are all elements of gender stereotyping, which one would expect to see in Abrahamic religions, yet we find it alive and well and deeply rooted in the modern goddess spirituality movement. We see this in the ideal image of a meek, subservient mother goddess as a peacekeeper and a good little wife, reduced to a chalice to be a vessel for the male seed, which is inserted in the form of a ceremonial dagger. We look back on this fantasy of a matriarchal society, one where a mother goddess took centre stage, yet many of today's pagans cast the mother goddess in a role that perpetuates the idea that women can only be kindly mothers and very little else. It reduces women to baby-making machines by its own actions. Yet, what is a mother? When you think of a mother, rather than thinking of a caring, loving nursemaid archetype, who picks you up off the ground when you fall, puts a band-aid on your skint knee, and pulls you into a warm, loving hug. Instead, think of a mother lion. Think of a mother lion, fiercely protective of her cubs. Think of her teeth bared, snarling ferociously, her claws razor sharp, ready to attack. Picture another predator wandering unknowingly into her vicinity, posing a threat to her children. Picture her flying wildly into attack, ripping the intruder limb from limb, its blood dripping from her gaping maw. There are many aspects to a mother, and not all exude pacifism. Inanna is the same mother lion in many ways, and it is such a shame that the goddess spirituality movement did not embrace that at the time. For a good mother can go to war to protect her own children, as well as defend herself. One of Inanna's most powerful myths is Inanna and Shukalutuda. In this myth, we see the goddess Inanna stopping by a city to rest, where she falls asleep. While she's asleep, she is raped by one of the town's inhabitants, a gardener named Shukalutuda. Rather than acting like a defanged and declawed mother goddess that the goddess movement tried to make her into, Inanna goes to war. Inanna seeks divine retribution against her rapist, on a yet untold biblical scale. Seeing the storm that is coming his way, the gardener asks the townspeople to hide him. This infuriates the goddess Inanna more, and we see her in the myth turning rivers to blood, tearing up plants by their roots, poisoning the city's food supply, unleashing a series of powerful storms, and sending great plagues upon the inhabitants of the city. This is perhaps one of the most powerful feminist myths we have, where a woman seeks justice against the man who abused her, and it is truly sad that the goddess spirituality movement would choose to ignore such a myth, only to instead turn Inanna into the very thing she opposes. At the same time as Inanna was not having the best of times with the goddess spirituality movement, who were trying to repackage her into something she was not, she was having just the same issues under Western academia. At the time, the Western academics did themselves no favour in choosing to censor and in some cases rewrite Inanna's literature. Many of her myths and prayers were deemed at the time too controversial to translate faithfully. Terms like vagina and vulva were replaced by terms deemed less offensive to the academics in question, who seemed uncomfortable with the subject matter of her hymns. This practice went on even up until the late 1990s. Safati preferred to substitute nakedness in place of both vulva and vagina in translations of Inanna's hymns, while Jacobson called them her private parts. Perhaps this is a symptom of both academics' inability to see women as sexual creatures, or just pure old-fashioned Puritanism. Whatever the reason, this censorship changed the meaning of Inanna's texts and literature. For example, the text, "For my nakedness, let us rejoice," has a very different connotation to the faithful translation of the text, which is, "For my vulva, let us rejoice." The former implies the goddess is celebrating the femininity of her body, while the latter is more evocative of a goddess fully embracing her own sexuality and her deepest desire to just enjoy sex. Many of these issues may also be reflective of our own society. For example, in 2012, two United States female politicians were banned from the Michigan House of Representatives after one of them used the word vagina. A modern survey also revealed that two-thirds of young women admitted they were too embarrassed to say the word vagina to their doctor, leading to increased risks of ovarian cancer. There is a stark contrast between a culture, like the Sumerians, that refers to their genitals by name, and our own culture that feels the need to use euphemisms, or are just too embarrassed to mention them at all. The greatest obstacle in seeing Inanna as a goddess of sexuality over a goddess of love is this constant embarrassment by past scholars and academics who just seem to dislike discussing sexual intercourse, especially the idea of a woman holding a prominent position and role in sex without losing her virtue, or making babies as a result of that act, which would have probably pleased the goddess spirituality movement of that era to no end, given their preoccupation with goddesses being archetypal mothers and little else. While academics quite rightly acknowledged that the Sumerians were an earthly people in their publications, it is truly sad that so many of them avoided the issue of Inanna's relationship to sexual activity purely for its enjoyment. Now, since we're on the subject of Inanna or Ishtar, it's worth touching on the Burney relief and a little bit about the history of the plaque. The Burney relief, also known as the Queen of the Night plaque, sits in the British Museum, and the identity of the goddess in the plaque is often majorly disputed, not just in academia but in pagan circles. Is it Ishtar? Is it Lilith? Is it Ereshkigal? Is it the goddess Ninlil? The plaque itself dates to the Ising-Larsen period. Before that time period, humanoid depictions of deity were considered taboo out with the temple, but during the Ising-Larsen period that all changed. Soon, depictions of deity were mass produced and were all over Mesopotamia and brought into people's homes. Now, the plaque itself was first identified to be the demoness Lilith by Samuel Noah Kramer in 1931, and this was based purely on the plaque having owls. And this has led to a lot of confusion among pagans today. However, Lilith was successfully argued against by Jacobson in 1987, who put forward Ishtar as the best candidate based on the iconography. Dr. Black put forward the possibility of Ereshkigal later, and up until fairly recently, academia has been torn between Ishtar and Ereshkigal as the best candidates for the goddess in question. The latest academic paper on the subject, which was released in 2014, argues strongly for Ishtar, and actually quite successfully, and she is currently the lead contender for the deity in the plaque. So let's have a look at the plaque and have a little bit of analysis into it. As you can see from the depiction on the left hand side, these are the actual colours of the plaque when it was originally produced. Now, if we look to the top of the head of the goddess in question, there is a horned crown, which represents divinity. Now, as during the time period Lilith was not considered a goddess but a demoness, the horned crown would not apply. Therefore, this rules out Lilith as a possibility. Next, we look to the symbols in the hands of the goddess in question, which are the rod and the ring symbols, which again are the divine powers that decree fates of mankind. Again, there are 7 great gods who decree fates of mankind, and Ereshkigal and Lilith were not on the 7 who decree fates list, but Ishtar was. Next, we look to the necklace and the bangles around the neck, which could be 2 of Inanna's or Ishtar's divine powers that she was wearing when she began the descent in the descent myth.
Next, we look at the patterns on the wings and the colour scheme in the wings, which again are similar to depictions of the goddess Inanna or Ishtar on the walls of the palace reliefs at Mari. Then we look at the colour of the goddess, red. Ishtar is described as red in mythology. In fact, her priestess is dressed in red, whereas Ereshkigal is always described as pale. Next, we look at the symbols of lions which the goddess is standing upon. Now, lions are Ishtar's sacred animal, as they are representative of divine kingship. Then we look to the owls to either side of the goddess. Now, owls are actually described as Ishtar's established envoy in her hymns. And then we look to the facial features. And again, if you look to the right hand side, you will see a picture of the Worka mask, which is the same facial features as the goddess in the plaque. Now, the Worka mask was found in the Inanna, Ishtar's temple in Uruk. Next, we looked at the earrings and the shape of the earrings, which are actually like Inanna's or Ishtar's ring post symbol, which you see to the bottom right. At the bottom of the plaque, we see the hilly region, which again is representative of the netherworld, and we know that the goddess descended to the netherworld and died there. And then we see the colour scheme of the plaque, which is the same colour scheme that was in the Temple of Inanna in Uruk, the Inanna. And finally, we looked at the claw feet, which are representative of death. So we could say, is this Ishtar or Inanna's death and resurrection scene from the Descent of Inanna myth? It may be. Inanna worship today. Many questions are asked as to why Inanna was so popular. Though answers vary, it is very clear from the evidence that she was a goddess of the people, not just the elite. She was many things to many people, and a fully formed goddess with many aspects, and, though not a mother goddess, her worship was much more prevalent. Understanding why that is may be the key to understanding her significance. I think the key to understanding this may be in understanding what Inanna represented to women versus what the mother goddess represented to women. A lot is made of the mother goddess among early academia and this obsession with discovering a matriarchal society. This clouds much of what Inanna truly was to women, especially in that time period. One way I like to look at it is to imagine what women would pray to in ancient times. Would it be love, or to find a man or woman they desire, to win his or her heart and have a happy life? Or would it be to just fall pregnant and have a safe birth? If you want a man or woman to love you, you would pray to Inanna. If you want to just fall pregnant, you would look to pray to the mother goddess. We can look even today and find an abundance of spells of love, yet very little spells to just fall pregnant. Inanna's incantations and her hand-lifting prayers are also deeply focused on healing and a long life. In her mythology, she bested the netherworld and returned unscathed, though a little worse for wear. Because of this, she was seen as a goddess who could resurrect the dead and bring the dead and those close to death back to life. She could also ensure victory in battle if she was on your side, and she granted kingship and ensured a long reign. She was a goddess of cunning and resource, and during this time, while other goddesses were losing their powers to the male deities, her strength continued to grow and thrive. To any woman in ancient times, she was a goddess you would look to for strength. She refused to be relegated to the role of a good little housewife and mother, as many women did in the society of the time. She was a fiercely feminist goddess long before the term feminism even existed. She was driven, resourceful, and capable of overpowering male deities at every turn. She took the powers of earth from the god of cunning Enki. She took the temple of heavens from the father of the gods An. She usurped the functions of the Nurta to fight the mountain and took his title, the killer of the mountains, for herself. Many pagans strangely point out that a goddess taking powers from male gods was a bad thing, yet at the time the opposite was taking place, with male gods taking the roles and functions of prominent goddesses at every turn. Yet Inanna bucked that trend. She fought against that concept. When we think of women's rights and the strive for equality, is this not the perfect role model that a woman needs? Yes, Inanna may have had a fiery temper, certainly to those who opposed her, and yet, when you understand her story, much of that was warranted. From her prayers, she also had a loving side, and she cared for those who followed her, and those who sang her praises were granted long life, happiness, and protection. The fact that the endurance of Inanna as a goddess spans almost 6 millennia should not be taken lightly. This was a goddess elevated above all others during most, if not all, of her worship, and who went on to influence a great many other deities across time and across history. Today, Inanna is still worshipped and honoured among a great many pagan faith traditions. From Wicca, where her myths are viewed as symbolic of the changing of seasons and part of the cycle of death and rebirth, to feminist pagan movements who see Inanna's role as a goddess who stood as a shining example of a woman unsuppressed. Her hymns and myths, so controversial, academics were afraid to even translate and publish them for hundreds of years. Right up until 1998, there was still censorship going on in much of her translations. And to queer pagan movements, who see Inanna as a goddess who can turn women into men and men into women and everything in between. Many of Inanna's gala priestesses were transgender, having undergone the head overturning rite, the famous Sumerian ritual which changed their gender from men into women and women into men. Even now, Inanna's worship continues to grow and spread, again as a testament to her endurance. The goddess who endured.